I think there's a few wandering in. We have just a couple minutes before we have to get started. I'm just going to do some housekeeping. If you're going to buy a book, we ask that you pay for it before you have it signed. Then we'll be signing in our bargain book department afterwards, so there'll be plenty of time. The registers close at 9 o'clock. Now, we're not going to kick you out at 9. If you're in line, we're not going to go, oh, sorry, get out. We will stay here until everybody's through line, so you don't have to worry about that, but you have to make your purchases before 9 o'clock, okay? And then, oh yeah, I always forget this one, and then Becky yells at me. The bathrooms are down the hall. So, you know, Lynn, you've been here so often, you feel like you're part of the Baker family. You really do. So I don't even know what else to say besides, if you haven't read her books, start. I mean, seriously. And it's fun talking to you all because you all have different favorites. I've been in a couple, what was the, Until We Got Home, I have Women's Place. Somebody even mentioned The New and the Long Way Home. We all have different ones because she touches our heart in so many ways. So I am so interested to find out what you got to say about your research on this book. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for coming out on this beautiful evening. You could be sitting out on your back deck having a nice al fresco dinner, but here you are. And I'm very excited to meet you all. I hope we have a chance to chat a little bit with you. I'm always interested in where you come from and what kind of books you like. And it is fun for me to hear what your favorite is because, like she said, they tend to all be different. People often ask me what my favorite book is, and that's hard because they're kind of like my children. And some children are a little more cooperative than others. Some have an easier birthing process than others. But yeah, they're all my favorites. But whenever I have a new one, I think there's a lot of authors feel the same way as I do. You're a little nervous putting that book out until your readers read it and you get the feedback. We liked it, we hated it, whatever it is. So whenever I have a new baby coming out, I'm always a little nervous till I get the feedback. But I have a wonderful launch team. It's a group of very devoted book lovers who help me launch the book, and they get an advanced copy and they get to read it ahead of time and post reviews and things. If you keep an eye on my website or my Facebook, they'll sometimes as an announcement for the launch team. And then your job is to, if you like it, if you don't like it, just sit under a rock somewhere. But if you like it, you know, post honest reviews, and it's a matter of telling your friends who will tell their friends who will tell their friends, because word of mouth is really the best way to promote a book. Because if you think about it, if somebody you know who's an avid book fan, if they say, "Oh, you've got to read this book," usually it's, you know, you'll try to read it. So we really rely on the launch team and the word of mouth, and I think there's some people here who are on my launch team. So thank you for coming. So I'm guessing that a lot of you have not read the book, and it's another World War II book, but with a little different twist on it this time. So I don't want to give any spoilers because I hate that when you find out all about the book and then you're 3/4 of the way through it and you know all of that so far. So I don't want to give any spoilers, but then what do I talk about without giving the whole thing away? So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my characters and a little bit about the setting of the book, and also what inspired me to write it, how I got the idea. So, and then I think afterwards there's question and answers. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to stay and try to answer them. All right, so where did the idea of the book come from? This is my dad, and he enlisted in the Navy when he was 18 and fought in the Pacific in the Philippines during the war. Now, two of my previous books, the one before this and before that, were both World War II books. most recent one took place in the Netherlands during World War II, Chasing Shadows. And the one before that is If I Were You, and that takes place in Great Britain. So I've been doing a lot of World War II research, and I always kept thinking about my dad. When I read about the battles and everything, I was trying to imagine him as 18 years old, going off to fight in a war. How many of you have a veteran somewhere in family? Yeah, quite a few. Did they ever talk about it? No. My dad never talked about it. And we had to do a lot of digging just to find out as much as we know, which isn't very much. So I kept thinking and wondering about how he reacted to the whole thing. And I thought, there's been a lot of books written about World War II, but not too many about what happens after the war, the aftermath, because everybody suffers during a war and there's repercussions. So I thought, I want to write about the veterans returning home. This is my dad again. He was a signal operator, a radio operator during the war. He was on a sub chaser, that's all we know, and he did the SOS. That's about the full extent of it. When I was researching the other books, I would come across on the internet interviews with veterans. And they might be in their 70s or 80s, and when they would talk about the war and what they experienced, so many of them would begin to weep. I mean, it had such an effect on them, if you can imagine, leaving small town America or even the city. My dad grew up in the city. And you're seeing things that you're not prepared for, not ready for. And I think so many of them came back with PTSD. But of course, it wasn't recognized after the Second World War. It wasn't recognized until the 1980s. So I just began to wonder how many soldiers came home with various degrees of PTSD. Now, my dad didn't seem to have anything obvious, but there were certain situations that would cause him anxiety. And one of them was crossing a big bridge with a lot of water underneath. And we kind of wondered if that would remind him of being on the ship, like the ship's rail and all the water. But he would get sometimes he'd have to have my mom drive over the bridge because that would bother him. And I wonder if that was a sort of type of PTSD. I ran into a book when I started researching it, written by the daughter of a veteran who also had mild PTSD, the veteran. And she was interviewing other daughters and sons of returning veterans and comparing their stories. And they began to realize there were a lot of servicemen who were affected, but they were just told, get over it, go home, they called it battle fatigue, and just get on with your life. But alcoholism was a big factor in a lot of the returning veterans' lives. And on my husband's side of the family, there were two relatives who went over as young men, 18, 19 years old, and had a lifelong struggle with alcoholism when they got home. And you wonder, was this PTSD that was unrecognized? So this is usually how we think of the war, and it ends, it comes to an end, and everybody's happy, they're kissing in the streets and celebrating. This, of course, was Times Square on PE Day, and remarkably, my mother was there. I said, did you get kissed? She said, no. But she was in Times Square on D-Day, and you think, this is history. I'm sure you have relatives that all have stories of the veterans who are returning from the war and what's going on. So I wanted to tell their story. Most of these people went home, got married, bought a little post-war bungalow, 2 bedrooms, had kids, lived happily ever after. But what about the ones who didn't? And I wanted to kind of tell their story, because I don't think anyone returns from a war unscathed. I think there's going to be scars there always. And we don't talk about this afterward. At least I've never seen any novels. Can you believe this? This is the Queen Elizabeth returning. They turned it into a troop ship, This is returning to the States after the war. I don't know how it's not sinking with all of those soldiers up on the front there, but can you imagine? All these men who've been through a war in various degrees, some on the front lines, maybe not all of them on the front lines, and now they're returning home and how they're going to get on with their lives. I think it's just amazing. So I decided to write this novel from 3 different viewpoints to kind of show what happens after the war. And the first viewpoint is from a returning soldier named Jimmy Barnett. He's one of the guys on the ship returning home. I'll tell you about the other 2. Okay, so this is what he might have walked away from over in Europe. And we don't think about that aspect of it either, that they've been over there, they've seen this incredible destruction, loss of life, you know, almost daily sometimes you're on edge, nervous, wondering about the bombs coming over. And then you come home to America, which was pretty much untouched. And how would you make that adjustment from this is your daily view to coming home and everything's happily ever after? This is Dresden, Germany. And it's just a glimpse of, I mean, if you take pictures all over Europe, it was like that. But like I say, post-traumatic stress syndrome was not recognized until in the 1980s by the American Psychiatric Association after the Vietnam War, 5 years after the Vietnam War. And they called it battle fatigue or shell shock. And the whole field of psychiatry was in its infancy. They didn't have any of the anti-anxiety meds to help the soldiers make this transition from this to normal life. And when you read the book, you might think I'm being very hard on the psychologists and psychiatrists, but what I've put in there on how battle fatigue was treated was all true. And I got it from a training video. My son found these training videos that the Army made, psychiatrists talking about these treatments and what they did. And I have to say that in this training video, that doctors just chain smoking cigarettes. So when you get to the part with the psychiatrist chain smoking, you know, that was legit. But the only courses of action for someone who is severely depressed, and in this case, Jimmy Barnett attempts suicide, you'll find that out in the first chapter. So I'm not giving anything away. But the only recourse was electric shock treatments, where they would apply electrodes and try to get your brain to go into a seizure. I don't know what that was supposed to do, burn out all the memories or something. But they did electric shock. They did insulin comas, where they would give the patients high dosages of insulin until they went into a coma, and they'd leave them there, I don't know how long, and then bump them out again, and that was supposed to reorder the brain or something. And then there was also water therapy, where they would blast the patients with alternating hot water and then cold water at like high velocity. I think you say, I'm cured, just to avoid me. Stop the water, I'm fine. Yeah. And the most shocking to me was there were thousands of surgical lobotomies performed in Veterans Hospital all across the United States. There was a doctor who was going around to all the Veterans Hospital promoting this. And even some of the nurses that had served overseas and were having trouble with depression, they performed lobotomies on them. So that to me was shocking. It's bad enough to come home with PTSD, but the treatments were just not very good. So that's the first character, is Jimmy Barnett, who comes home. He's a soldier, he comes home and he's struggling with PTSD. The second viewpoint is from a young woman called Peggy Serrano. And she is a longtime friend of Jimmy. She grew up, he lived across the street from her, and he was 4 years older than her, and he kind of always watched out for her. And during the war, this is what she did. She became a Rosie the Riveter. Now, we don't often think about it, but for a lot of women, they go in the workplace, they're having a job, they're having a purpose. And then they have to make this huge adjustment because women do men's jobs. Here's the iconic Rosie the Riveter. I'm not sure I'd want her muscles. She looks a little bit brawny there. But, you know, women who really had not a whole lot besides a teacher or a nurse or a housewife, secretary. Suddenly they're doing these jobs, important jobs and work on the home front. And they had to first make that adjustment to the workplace. Then when the soldiers came home, that whole boatload full of military men coming home, they wanted their jobs back. So all the women got kicked out. So they had to make the adjustment all over again. And some women happily went back to their homes and families and children, but some, they had gotten a real sense of purpose with this work and they wanted to keep going. I threw my mom in here because if you saw a picture of my dad, you got to see a picture of my mom too. And she was a nurse during World War II. She studied nursing. That's why she was down in New York City on VE Day. And she was in the Navy also. She never got deployed because she had just finished her course when the war happily ended. So she never got sent overseas or anything. But again, she came from a small town, poor family, never would have had a higher education, never would have had a chance if not for the war. And so suddenly she's needed, she's wanted, she can be a nurse. And she met my dad, and about a year later, my sister was born, and that was the end of nursing. So again, you know, you have to make all these readjustments to a war idea and then a not a war idea. So the second main character, Peggy Serrano, really finds a sense of purpose during the war, working, and then of course she sort of cut adrift once the men come back and she has no purpose anymore. But she wants to help her friend, Jimmy. So a little bit about the setting. This is the valley, Hudson Valley, New York State. There's a part in the book, if you've read it, where they go up to the hairpin turn up to the lookout, and that's where this was taken. This is a real place. It happens to be where I grew up, the area of New York State where I grew up. And the reason I used it was COVID. Because normally I love to travel and find interesting exotic locales for my books. So that's part of the fun for me is, you know, go someplace new. But of course with COVID, you couldn't go anywhere. I could drive home to New York and take lots of pictures. So part of the reason the setting is there is because that's where I grew up. The town in the book is sort of fictitious. I based it on all the little tiny towns throughout this region of New York. It's a big dairy farming area and orchard area. And so I picked this house. What I do is I take lots of pictures and then I have a bulletin board in my space where I write, and I put all the pictures there and pictures of my characters. I usually cut out what I think they might have looked like. And that way, when I sit down to write, it's easy to envision, it's easy to picture. So this is Jimmy Barnett's house, and I don't really know who really lives there, but they got a picture of their house. And so when you imagine him, his hometown, where he grew up, this is sort of the idyllic life he had, and then he ends up over everything he experiences during the war. Hometown also have the church, and church was a big part of everybody's life back in, at least in this rural area where I grew up. And I think that's another casualty of war that isn't often talked about, is the loss of faith for so many people. There, you know, this is your idea, this little hometown church of religion, and then you're out there and a lot of people start asking, how could God let this happen? Where is God? And I can't answer all those questions, obviously, but I think that's something I wanted to explore in the book, is that your faith gets shaken when you go through something like a war, something like these traumatic experiences. one more picture. Again, these are the mountains in this little valley where I grew up. And you'll see there's a thoroughbred horse ranch in the story. And I based it on this real thoroughbred horse ranch in this town where I grew up. Jimmy Barnett's father is a veterinarian, and Peggy Serrano, the girl across the street, helps him out sometimes and really loves that work. And Jimmy had intended to be a veterinarian before he enlisted. He was studying to be a veterinarian when he enlisted. Another view of the Hudson Valley. If you've never been there, it really is pretty. The Hudson River is a beautiful river. The mountains come right down to the edge, and it's lovely. In the book, you'll see when they have to go across the other side of the Hudson, they have to take a ferry because this bridge wasn't built. Now they have bridges, but in the book, every time they wanted to cross the Hudson, they had to take a ferry. So I think it's a very scenic, very pretty part of the world. Let's see what's next. Okay, so Jimmy Barnett, Peggy Serrano, and here's another character. Peggy's desperate to help Jimmy, and so along with Jimmy's parents, they start going through Jimmy's bags and letters and trying to figure out what happened that made him so depressed that he became suicidal. And as they're going through his belongings, they find a picture, probably a lot like this, of a nurse. And on the back is the name Gisela. And so as the story progresses, she's trying to find out who is Gisela and how does she fit into the story? How does she connect with Jimmy and Jimmy's story? Maybe another page. So this is the second viewpoint that I tell the story from, because Gisela is Jewish and she's in Europe, and her story begins with this ship. It's called the SS St. Louis, and it sailed from Hamburg, Germany in May of 1939 with 900 Jewish passengers on board. And they were desperate to escape Nazi persecution. Now, this is a true story. I just sort of wove Gisela into the true story and the true account of this SS St. Louis. And you see all the soldiers, the Nazis there lining up. This was before the war started. This was in May. The war actually broke out in September, or it was declared in September. So at this point in May, Hitler was glad to get rid of, yeah, fine, as many Jews want to leave, leave. There was no place for them to go. Most countries would take them. Netherlands set up a refugee camp near their border, and I talk about that in the book Chasing Shadows, and they let some in. And I think if you know the story of Anne Frank, her parents, her family also came from Germany to Netherlands as refugees. So this ship full of Jewish people, they had gotten landing permits for Havana, Cuba, and they were supposed to start a whole new life in Havana, Cuba. Here's a picture of some of the passengers actually from the St. Louis, how happy they are and how thrilled they are. They're getting out of Germany, which was already persecuting and really cracking down on the Jewish people. They needed to get out. Here's another one of a real family on board this St. Louis. No country would take them. Most of them would like to have gone to the United States, but the US had quotas on refugees, the number of Jewish refugees they let in, only a certain number a year. And so there were long waiting lists to get in. So a lot of them just would go anywhere that would take them, that would let them land, where they could wait until their name came up to go to the United States. So this ship full of passengers was headed for Havana, Cuba. Now, when it got to Cuba, they found out that there were bribes, like most of them had paid a bribe to get this landing permit, and they weren't going to be honored in Havana, Cuba. So the ship sat in the harbor while all the mucky mucks tried to figure out, what are we going to do with this shipload of people? Are we going to let them in? What are we going to do? And the little ships that you see there are the relatives of some of the passengers, they were waiting for their relatives to land and they weren't being allowed to land. So they would come out in these little boats and sort of shout up to them and asking, you know, hey, are you all right? Everything. And these people were desperate to land. I won't tell you what happens because that would spoil the book. But I just wanted you to know this is a true story, and it was based on the real thing. And that was another story I wanted to tell, because one of the aftermaths of war, and it starts during the war, is the problem of refugees. Where do they go? Who's going to take them? How are they going to eat? Obviously, they want to be out of the danger area. You have so many leaving Ukraine now, and you can't blame them. But for the Jewish people, it was even worse because we all know what happened, but they were already feeling the persecution. So this is another aftermath of war. This is Cologne, Germany. And I look at the pictures like this and I think, where would you start? How would you even, and you, like I say, imagine in America, it's pretty nice, you know, like we weren't bombed out like this. So when the war is over and the refugees are trying to get back to where they came from, this might be where they came from. What would you do? Where would you go? How would you live? How do you make a living? Even the refugees who wanted to go home, you know, there's no home. And we don't think about that, you know, again, it's like sailor kissing the girl, the war is over, we're all happy. But this is war's aftermath that we don't often think about. These are Jewish children who were probably hidden during the war and whose families were probably mostly killed. And they're in a displaced persons camp. This is a school picture. They were studying, and if you see it up close, some of them have soldiers' uniforms on, some have like old coats on. It's just like no clothing, no food, no family. What would you do? By the end of 1945, the war was over, and all these countries in Europe are trying to relocate the survivors to their homes. They said at the end of 1945, there were still 1 million refugees still in these displaced persons camp, trying to figure out where they're going to go, what they're going to do. And most of them were destined to remain in the camps another 3 to 5 years after the war. I never knew this, but the last camp, displaced persons camp, closed in 1957. Oh, wow. So we were going on about our lives. I don't know about you, but I was in elementary school, you know, the war seemed like something my dad would watch on the movies on TV. And displaced persons were still in the camp, most of them Jewish. And they either couldn't go back to where they came from or they didn't want to. Would you want to go back to Cologne, Germany if you had suffered persecution there and their houses were gone, everything was, you know, confiscated? And where are they going to go? And because of the quotas, they wanted to come to America. It said 250,000 Jewish people applied to move as refugees to America, 250,000. They let in 50,000. Now that's a lot of people left over who don't have any place to go. And immigration to Israel was blocked until it became a nation in 1948. So refugees, what happens to them? Where do they go? How do they start over? How do you rebuild? I know this sounds very depressing, right? We've got all these people. Jimmy's got PTSD and Peggy's trying to find her way and the ship's trying to land in Germany. And you're probably in Cuba. You're probably wondering how these stories all come together, but just trust me, they'll all come together. And this really is not a depressing book. I don't write, well, I guess there's depressing parts, but I want to leave you with hope. That because we're facing a lot of the same issues today. We're facing refugees, the aftermath of war, hunger in these areas. And, you know, to me, it fires me up to want to see the problem and figure out a solution. And I think get together as Christian communities, we can help resolve some of these things. Now, there's one more character I want to tell you about, and this is me with my sister's dog, whose name is Franny. But she was the model for one of the characters in the book, which is a dog named Buster. And he plays a very important role in the story. How many of you have pets? You know how much the pets mean to you and how they kind of know when you're sad and they frolic when you're happy, they're happy. And so I really wanted to make a pet have an important role in the story. So I always like to read a portion from the book. I enjoy hearing the story in the author's voice, so I'm assuming you might want to hear it in my voice too. So I was trying to figure out what part I could read because I don't want to give away too much. And then an incident happened. I want to tell you a little story and that will explain why I picked the part I picked. Last month, I went to New York State, back home to my home area. I live in Holland, by the way, which is just down the road. And I went because my mom is 96. She lives with my sister and her husband. And my sister and husband wanted to go on vacation. So I offered to come out and take care of my mom and Franny. That was part of the job, so walking the dog. And while I was there, after my sister was long gone, my mother had a stroke. And I was home alone with her when it happened. And I happened to know the signs of a stroke. So if you don't know the signs of a stroke, go home and read it because you have 3 hours and they have a drug they can do to bust the clot and have a good outcome if you can get the help in 3 hours, but that's the key. And I just happened to know the symptoms of stroke and I called the ambulance and she went off. And they moved her to a stroke center down by New York City. Now it has a happy ending. My mom is recovering in a nursing home and there was no paralysis or loss of, she just needs to get her strength back. So that was a good ending. But for a number of weeks or days before my sister could get home, I was all alone down in New York City. I had to get a hotel, going back and forth to the hospital to see my mom. And it can get pretty depressing when you're all alone and you're in this humongous hospital. And there was a young man at the desk where the visitors would get a visitor's pass. And every day when visiting hours open, there'd be long lines of people and they're handing out these passes. But this one young man, he always had a smile as much as you could see behind his mask. You could see his eyes. He always had a friendly, good morning. How are you? How are you doing today? And just something. And when you're in this stressful situation, you'd be amazed at how that just little personal, somebody caring. After the first or second day, he knew my name when I would come up. Miss Lynn, how are you? He'd print out my badge. I mean, I would deliberately get in his line because these other people are just sort of slapping out the badges, next. So he has this nothing job. I mean, it's got to be boring. But he just approached it in a very personal way. And he was such a blessing to me just to have that one touch of humanity in this whole big situation. There was one other young man who would wheel patients from their rooms down to get CTs or other exams. And he let me go with my mom when she was going for a CT. And he was the same way. How are you? How are you doing? And when they were doing the CT, they asked my mother, what kind of music do you like? And she said, oh, I like Frank Sinatra. So while she's having the CT, they're playing Frank Sinatra. And I'm thinking, these little extra things that remind you that you're not a number, that you're a person. And it's so easy to do, like we would like to think, I would like to think I'd be a hero during the war, that I'd be a nurse or something important. But we could be everyday heroes, just that smile, that gift, that personal touch. It just meant so much to me at a time of stress. And I'm determined now to just try to pay it back somehow or other. His name was James. And I still think about James. I don't know if he was a Christian, but I suspect he was. because he sure was cheerful for a nothing job. All right, so that reminded me of an incident in the book. So this is the part I want to read you. Peggy Serrano is talking to one of Jim's friends that he knew, one of his army buddies, and she's asking him to tell her a little bit about Jimmy and what went on during the war. She says, "We're hoping you can tell us about your time with Jim and how you adjusted to civilian life afterwards so we can help Jimmy get better." Art drew a deep breath as if about to plunge into cold water. "I'm sorry to hear about Jim, but to tell you the truth, I'm not surprised. Anyone who was there at that camp and saw the things we did, I admit there are days when I still have a hard time with it. I think Jim was even more deeply affected than I was. Having the love and support of my wife made all the difference, I think. It was like she was able to show me that there are still some good in this world and some hope for the future. I know Jim wasn't married. Are you his girlfriend?" "Just a friend." It helps to have good friends. I had only known Jim for a few months by the time the camp was liberated in April of '45, but it felt like we'd known each other all our lives because of everything we went through. Experiencing the carnage of warfare and seeing so many young men gravely wounded and dying, that would give any sane man reason enough to want to check out of this world. But then we came to Buchenwald. He paused and I saw him struggling with his emotions. Even now, it's hard for me to talk about. You don't want to remember, but the memory is seared into your brain and your heart, and it's impossible to forget. We don't dare to forget. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice sounded raw. I won't describe it for you because it's beyond description. Jim and I were both deeply shaken to see the things that evil men are capable of doing to their fellow human beings. Jim fell to his knees and wept right there on the road. I wanted to do the same, but all of these skeletons were shuffling towards us, some of them kneeling down, trying to kiss our feet. So I pulled him up again. We had to get to work, doing what we could for them. It was the only way to keep from breaking down ourselves. Tears filled Art's eyes, but he didn't try to wipe them. We eventually set up a hospital in the former SS barracks and attended to the survivors who were closest to death. Jim would look each person in the eye and he would ask their name. He would remember them all too and call everyone by name whenever he took care of them. They had been treated like animals for so long, Jim said, that he wanted to let them know they were still living people with names and a soul. He said we needed to restore their dignity and humanity as much as we needed to restore their bodies. So that reminded me to try to see the image of Christ in people wherever I go. So that's all I have for you, but like I say, if you have some questions, comments.
The chief asked first, are you gonna write about the Pacific during World War II?
If I could find some more information about my dad, I would love to. Yeah, maybe. I'm a little burned out on the war at the moment. I think I wanted to write something a little happier, so. Yeah.
Anybody else got a question? I know a couple of you do because you mentioned them to me, so raise your hand, it's okay.
Does it take, once you get an idea from the book, how long does it on the average take you from first thoughts until it's published with the time you spend with research?
Yeah, it takes me a year. I have a contract to write a book a year, so I gotta fit it in that space.
Oh, wow.
But that includes the research and everything. And I don't have to know everything to start writing. I just have to, have enough ideas to get me going. And I can look things up as I go along. But yeah, it takes me a year to write.
Do you ever consider sequels like Waves of Mercy?
Well, the sequels I've written were accidental. Like Waves of Mercy, I think everybody was up in arms, like, you gotta tell us what happened. I mean, I think they're finished, But, so I imagine that there might be people who wanna know what happens to them afterwards, but no, I don't usually think of sequels, because where do you stop, you know? Then they get married and have kids, and then the kids, you wanna know what happens to them, and then, yeah. It's hard to find a stopping point.
Speaking of sequels, I was thinking we should write one on Ruthie, and I don't know if I'm saying her name right, because I listened to the audiobook, and, but I really think that there is a story there.
Which one?
The book that you just are talking about, Long Way Home, Ruthie,
Oh.
or Ruthie. Yeah.
Oh, Ruthie, okay.
Younger
I
sister.
had to remember who Ruthie is.
So I think there's a story there.
There's always a story, yeah.
And
That's
then,
the problem.
I also, like, you're from the area, so you already know that there is a parachute wedding dress over at the air zoo.
Oh,
Have you been there and seen it? There is one on display
okay.
that you can see there that's made out of a parachute, and it's really pretty.
Wow, yeah, that's in the story too, and that was a true story. I like to fit in, did you read this book, right?
Yeah, I just
I
listened
like
to it.
I like to fit in true stories in among it, and the story of the parachute wedding gown was a true story. But no, I didn't know that. I'll have to go over there and check it out.
It's really pretty. And I just want to tell you that I was very encouraged by this phrase that you put in there. It's at the end, but it's not going to give away anything.
Okay.
Light cannot be extinguished by darkness. That was very encouraging to me. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, because that, you know, you talk about the Holocaust, one of the darkest periods in human history, but
What is a very interesting fact that you learned about the 40s and researching this book?
we're learn about
Just the era, like the time.
the era. So many, but I think all the creative ways that Jews were hidden and the people that helped them and the ordinary people, like I started getting these stories when I was doing Chasing Shadows, but you know, that ordinary people risking their own lives to hide a fellow human being. And, you know, there were just so many interesting stories of how they were hidden and where they were hidden. And, you know, I read The Hiding Place a long time ago, and that intrigued me. And I actually got to see Corrie ten Boom's house in the Netherlands and saw this tiny little space where they hid the Jews, and it just fascinated me. But in this book as well, most of the European war stuff takes place in Belgium. And, you know, that was like the Belgian people were doing other creative ways to hide the Jewish people. And it just makes me wonder how brave I would be. And, you know, because one thing to risk your own life, but so many of the people had families, children of their own, and they're risking their whole family by hiding Jews. I was also astounded by the fact that nobody would take in the refugees, take in the Jews who were desperate to leave Germany. Now, of course, hindsight's 2020. We know about the Holocaust. We know about the concentration camps. They didn't really know about that then. So, but I suppose they couldn't believe people would, you know, be that inhumane.
Okay, we got one from online. Becky just scared the living daylights out of me, so sorry for everybody around here. Wow. If you could write about any time period without restrictions from a publisher, what would it be?
Well, I don't really have a lot of restrictions from the publisher. They're usually pretty happy with anything I come up with. The tricky part is now, at this point, having written 20-some books, is to find an area that I haven't researched before, you know, and to try to find something new and a new slant on it. So you're not just, I don't want to rewrite the same book over and over. I want all of my books to be different and unique from each other. So any time period, I don't know. I'm thinking maybe the era where when I was growing up, I know Susie I read the birds, the Wizcov,
nature song.
The nature of small birds, and it was my era, the Vietnam era and all of that. And I thought, on the one hand, that's history. Makes me feel very old.
Yeah.
But the way she wrote it, it brought back so many memories of that time period, and I kind of intrigues me because I have a lot of memories of the Vietnam War and worrying about my boyfriend, who I'm now married to, having to go to Vietnam. So. Yes, Rose.
Each book that you've written, have you always traveled somewhere out of country for your research?
I'm trying to think. Pretty much, because the very first books I wrote were the Israel books, the Chronicles of the King Hezekiah, everything you ever want to know about King Hezekiah, but we're afraid to ask. And I went to Israel while I was writing that, and that kind of got the bug in me that, hey, this is really a neat perk of writing. My husband says, how about Fiji Island? So as much as possible, I do like to, if I thought long enough, I probably could come up with one that I didn't go, but yeah.
I don't really need the microphone. I think I can talk a lot.
People online.
Okay.
It's your mouth.
I've wanted to know this for a long time. As I was reading some things, I found out that you went on an archaeological site. I would love to know more about this. What made you do it? What was it like? Did you go with your son? I bet a lot of us would like to know.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to ask you this.
Archaeological dig has always been on my bucket list. And when I was researching the Hezekiah books, one of the resources I use is a magazine called Biblical Archaeology Review. And they talk about all the digs in Israel and in that part of the country, of the world, and what they discover. And so I use that magazine as background. Well, every year, once a year, they publish dig opportunities. And they'll list all the archaeological dig, yeah, you should go. And they vary, some are a week, some are, the one I went on was a month. And we dug in the ancient city of Timnah, which, if you remember the story of Samson, before Delilah, he fell in love with a Philistine woman who was from the village of Timnah. And she gave away his secret, and it did not end well. And but that was the town that we were digging in. It's right on the border between Philistine country and Israel. So half the time it was a Philistine town, and sometimes it was an Israeli town. And it went all the way back to like early times. The layer where I worked was Samson's era. And it was the main city gate, and it was like a nice little cobblestone street that we uncovered by the main city gate. And it was just awesome to think Samson could have walked on these very stones. But if you ever get a chance, I mean, the volunteer thing, volunteer opportunities, they're in the magazine. There's all sorts of, they let ordinary people come. You have to sort of pay your own way. But we were housed at a moshav, which is like a collective farm. Very nice housing, wonderful food. We had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to beat the heat, because you had to dig before, noon, and then you're done because it's too hot. But it was just an awesome experience. It was part of a class, like I could get credit in biblical backgrounds, which is what the other reason I wanted to go, is the archaeologists would talk about the finds every day and what it told about the period. And for about a week before we started digging, we went on a tour all around Israel to all these archaeological sites that were important. And it was just fascinating. And there's just so much digging going on over there that if this is on your bucket list, it is completely doable. I think my son was the youngest at 14, and then one of the oldest was in her 80s. And they readjust the work to what you're capable of doing. And it was just I'd go again in a minute. We dug a lot of dirt. When we started, we were on ground level, and when we finished, you dig straight down pits. Like when we finished, if you raised your hand, you couldn't touch the top. So it's just like bucket by bucket looking for things. My son wanted to find a skull. And he ended up, the area where he was, they uncovered a whole skeleton. So he was thrilled. And they found this little, it's an idol, like a fertility idol. And he came running over to my section to show it to me. And I said, what is that? He said, well, it's a fertility idol. And I'm like, put it down. But it was very, very fun, very memorable. And they have, if you go to Israel, they also have a dig for a day. And some of the tours, if you go on, if you request it, you can go to an area where they're sifting through rubble and stuff, and you can volunteer for a day on a dig. I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you for highlighting the experiences of veterans. Do you ever get a chance to talk to like the American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Veterans of America?
Yeah.
About this? Some of the national conventions and so forth. I would think they would welcome you.
Not lately. My dad was big in the VFW, and I suppose they would talk about their experiences there. But if you go online, there are quite a few groups that are trying to hang on to these memories, and they interview survivors of like ships that have gone down, and people on the front line, and like I spent probably a week watching videos. I mean, it's just mesmerizing. And of the soldiers who liberated the camps and what that was like. And some of the veterans would be in their 80s now, and they're thinking of something that was what, 70 years ago, and still weeping.
Yeah.
Yeah. My husband plays in the Holland American Legion Band, and for the 70th anniversary of D-Day, the whole band went to Normandy Beach, and they played a series of concerts throughout Normandy, and we visited the cemeteries and the landing sites and all of that. It was just absolutely, you come out of there and you're just, you cannot believe the heroism of pulling up on this beach and, you know, being mowed down. It's just incredible.
Hi, Lynn.
Hi.
I'm gonna dig into your writer brain.
Okay.
How long does it take you? Are you thinking of the next book while you're writing? Still finishing up a book, or do you wait till the book is completely done and then start into the next project?
It depends, because sometimes it bleeds over. Like in this case, when I was researching the other World War II books, I would run into things that, you know, I'm already thinking of the next book. But sometimes I finish, like when I finished this, I just wanted a completely different direction. And it took me a while to think of what is gonna come next. That's, you know, this is such a weighty subject, and I don't wanna just write frivolous stuff, but I need a break, and I think the readers need a break too, because some of this stuff is heartbreaking. But I'll start researching a general topic, and then that starts giving me ideas. Like for my next book, what popped into my mind was the Gilded Age. I wanted to know more about the Gilded Age. Now they have a movie on TV, or a series, The Gilded Age. I haven't watched it because I don't want to be copycatting at all. But so I would just take a broad topic like the Gilded Age and just get some resources, start reading and getting, you know, some ideas. And then usually I start thinking of characters. I start thinking of some plot ideas and stuff. And so by the time I've researched for a month or so, visited some big Gilded Age mansions, that sort of thing, then the ideas get rolling, and then I can start writing. But yeah, you know, after 20, what have I have, 29 books or something like that, it's hard to come up with another topic. So you could help me out here and tell me a story. Yeah.
I have somebody that's wondering how many hours do you spend writing a day?
Well, I set myself at normal times, normal working hours, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And my goal is 5 pages a day. Now, if I get off on a real run and I write more than 5 pages, or if it's before 5 o'clock, then I'm celebrating. I can go off, I can do whatever I want. But what happens more often is if I don't reach my 5 pages, by the end of the week, then I'm either working at night, if my husband's at a rehearsal, or I'm spilling over onto Saturday or something like that. But if I write 5 pages a day and consistently, I can take time out for Christmas or, you know, fun summer, and I can usually get a book, my size book, done in a year.
And question for you. I'm just curious, where in the process do you know the end? Do you know it at the beginning or? is it-
No, I don't. No, I throw my characters in the soup and see what happens. And this one, I was wondering pretty far along, and how am I going to end this? But it's usually that way. I'm usually almost to the end, and then it's like driving through the fog at night. You can just see enough to keep going. But yeah, sometimes it's like, oh, okay, I see the ending. Yeah, but no, it's a long haul.
I know that a lot of different authors have different opinions on this, but how far back do you consider where historical fiction is and more contemporary fiction is?
Okay. I go by, if you go in an antique shop, they tell you anything 50 years and older is an antique, which is very depressing.
Yes,
because
yes.
I don't much consider myself as an antique. But generally speaking, I think that's about what they call. Yeah, it's funny. I have a book called Fly Away, which I wrote. When I wrote it, it was contemporary, it's like in the 80s or something. But now it would be historical fiction. If it comes out, it'll be, I mean, it's sort of out of print. You can get an ebook version of it. Can't get a print, but it's, yeah, it would be historical fiction then.
With all the researching that you have to do for book writing, do you have time to read anything for fun? And what kind of thing would you pick up and read just for your own kicks and giggles?
I'm always reading something for fun. I cannot just, it's like I run out of words and I have to put the words back in. And so, yeah, I always have a book by my bed. I'm always reading. And when I'm off, like when I went out to New York, I had a whole bunch of books that on the airplane, going, coming, you know, I have to just read. They say before you, if you want to be a writer, before you start writing, you should read at least 100 books. But some people read that many in a year. I don't read quite that many. I do keep track of how many I read, and that's maybe averages about 1 a week. But some of those are.
Do you read historical fiction mostly, or?
I do, but I try not to read from the same era that I'm writing, because we're using the same pool of research, right? And so there's going to be similar things, and I don't want to be accused of. But yeah, so I wasn't reading World War II books when I was writing them, but now I'm reading World War II. But I like a good mystery. I like chick lit, believe it or not. And I like to go to book clubs, and I like to ask them what they have been reading and what are their favorites. So if you have any good favorites for me, I would love to hear it. So I will plug one book that I most recently read that I just loved, was called Cuckoo Land. It's not a Christian book. It's the author's a secular author, but Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. I read his first book, which is a World War II book called All the Light We Cannot See. And when I finished it, I closed it and I said, I quit. I quit. This is just so beautifully written. Then I found out he won a Pulitzer Prize for that book, and I thought, all right, I'm not trying to win a Pulitzer Prize, so maybe I'll keep writing. But Cuckoo Land is about the power of story, and it's really, really good book. Also thick. I like thick books.
Okay, we're nearing 8 o'clock here, so we usually like to wrap it up about that time. So if you give us a few minutes, we're gonna get Lynn set up in the back by the table. I think she'll probably like to take her computer down too. So you're welcome to get a drink. The cafe does close at 8:45. I forgot to mention that earlier. So if you want to drink, get in line first for that, and then don't forget the register's closed at 9. Thank you for those that joined us online. We really appreciate you coming in and visiting with us. Thank you for all coming to the store. We really enjoyed the evening.